Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Ray. I'm here to give you an overview of the Romantic era. This lecture is meant to be considered in tandem with the reading in our book, The Introduction to the Romantic Era. And also, please keep in mind that anytime during any of my videos, you're welcome to pause, leave, come back. They'll be waiting for you. I realize it's an information dump in the beginning of a semester, and it's okay to take it piecemeal. So I'm looking at page 3 in our book, and there's this glorious timeline right here. And just some of the key events during this era that I'm going to dig into a little bit is 1785 is fascinating. It's actually the first hospital teaching school is founded in London. So there's more of like there's a shaping to the profession of medicine per se. In 1787, there's an abolition of the slave trade. And again, that's we'll talk about how that's the beginning of ending the slave trade, which is really positive, but it certainly isn't gone yet. The French Revolution and Napoleon. There's turnover in the monarchy that's leaving society a little bit panicked, and we'll come back to the rest of it because the rest of that kind of bridges on the Victorian era. But the first industrial revolution is coming through, so let's just look at this together. To imagine an era, I always think it's super helpful to see what it would have been like to live then. And a huge part of living in the late 1700s, early 1800s was how do you get around? And the truth is, you didn't get around that far. They were just starting to invent the steam engine, but that wasn't up and running yet. Um, Roads were poorly constructed. Night travel was exceedingly dangerous. Right, all you would have was a lantern. There was no gas lamps yet. There were highwaymen. You would get stuck in mud, rain. Right, there was no paved roads. Most people never traveled more than 14 miles from their home. So if your sister moved from, I don't know, Edinburgh to Glasgow, you probably never see her again. Walking and horseback were the primary methods of getting around. On the bottom left, you can see there's what's called a hack. It's almost like a cab that you could hire to drive you around London or a major city, but that was kind of pricey, especially if you were struggling financially. In the middle, you can see a link boy lighting the way for a couple. If you were going to see around in the dark, you needed someone who had a torch or a lantern ready to go. On the top is an illustration by one of my favorite Victorian authors, William Thackeray, but it captures this is a coach in Killarney, so it's in Ireland. But it captures that everyone is just like falling off, switched together, sitting between legs, but just accepting it because that's how you traveled. What else are you going to do? On the bottom right is a drawing of London at that time. If you were extremely wealthy, you might have your own carriage and horses and coachmen to take you around. That was very few people. You would hire one, you might have one for your business. It was so smelly in London. I can't even tell you because manure was everywhere. There were no like set laws to remove it. Sometimes if a horse died, they would leave it in the street because it was cheaper than trying to. It was horrible. We romanticize horseback travel. It was pretty gruesome at this time. So again, people didn't travel very far and it was very expensive. Fashion. So if you've ever seen a Jane Austen movie, that is the Romantic era. I have never seen Bridgerton. I know it was a huge smash on Netflix. That is set during the Romantic era. Um, what was fashion like? So people were really inspired by neoclassicism. What that means is antiquity. So if you've ever seen like an image of like a Roman statue with kind of like the flowing togas and stuff like that or dresses, that's what the women were inspired by in this period. So lots of A-line hemlines, right below the bust, um, draping shawls, low necklines. Napoleon, when he was occupying Europe, brought back, and not him himself, but his whole campaign brought back fashions from Egypt and different places. So if you look at the middle image, women started to wear turbans. They were inspired by this, or furs, which were very popular in Russia. So kind of more global fashions were flooding the English market beyond just what was going on in France, which is always the most fashion forward country. At least that's the stereotype, right? Men, oh, first, before I get to men, women, so many layers. So you would have a corset or stays, which you can see in the bottom right. Um, there's lots of stories that they were terrible, but they weren't as bad as maybe some of the old wives' tales you've heard. Very rarely were they like cracking ribs and redefining where organs went, but they were very uncomfortable. On top, underneath that, you'd need like a camise, which is like a slip, and then a petticoat to make your dress stand out. You haven't even put on your dress yet. So many layers of clothes, especially for women. For men, you'd have what's like on top you can look a waistcoat beneath your formal coat, which would be cut high up front and long in back. Thanks goodness around this time they went from the top left, which is the breeches with the high socks that you might have seen on like Minutemen, George Washington, to the longer pants that you see in the bottom. People started wearing more boots and stuff like that. Cravats were always in fashion. It was considered indecent for a man to walk around with his neck exposed. I don't know why, but that's what it was. Hats were important. In the middle, you can see even people who were considered the lower classes, the impoverished, were still influenced by this fashion. Just not to the most ornate degree that you would see maybe in the bottom right, and the woman in the formal gown. Moving on to politics, what was going on in the background? So who you have on the far left, if you've ever seen Hamilton, right? We've got King George III, right, who sings "You'll Be Back." Jonathan Groff did a brilliant job in the original. But lots of things happen under King George III. We think of him as the guy who had tried to up our taxes without representation, and we had a revolution against him. Certainly, that was part of his tenure as king, but a small part of what happened. He defeated France during this period during the 7 Years' War. He oversaw the Act of Union in 1800, which made Ireland part of Britain. He was involved in ending the British transatlantic slave trade. So again, slavery was still occurring in the British colonies. I don't want to make it sound like it wasn't. A lot of the people in Jane Austen novels who are so rich, the money that they have is coming from the colonies that they've invested in, which is, pretty gross. Horrific, of course. But it was the beginning of deconstructing the slave trade in 1807. He was king when like I'm British, defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. Unfortunately, around this time, around 1810, he descended into madness. And there's been a lot of theories about what was going on. Some people have said it's bipolar disorder. Others have actually tested his hair and seen high levels of arsenic that could have come from cosmetics or anything else they were exposed to at the time. But he would he shook hands with a tree. I guess he confused it for a person. He would get physically violent, have to be restrained. So in 1810, 10 years before his death, his son actually took over. So moving forward to King George IV, his son. So again, let me pause because my dogs are losing their mind. Okay, it looks like my son answered the door. Apologies for that. But moving on to George IV. So again, he was standing in for his father as Prince Regent. He officially became king when his father died. And let's talk about George IV. He was only king for 10 years. He loved style and fashion and the finer things in life. And he was often called the first gentleman of England because he was so taken with the arts and propriety and all these things. But you can imagine that when there's people starving, when there's people living in muck, they're not a big fan of someone who's this obsessed with the finer things in life that they have no familiarity with except by paying taxes towards it, right? And when the French Revolution is brewing, there's a lot of anxiety in England, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. He let his prime minister kind of run the show. He was very big on like picking favorites and letting them, be the people that influenced his decisions. Also very problematic. This is where it gets confusing. Why are we having so many kings so fast? He only had one legitimate child with his wife that lived till adulthood, and that was Princess Charlotte, and people loved her. They were so excited that he was going to pass someday and she was going to be queen. They saw her as representing their values, and she married Leopold of Saxony. They're like, wonderful, this is going to be perfect. And then she dies in childbirth at like 21, and they hung black everywhere, and they were like, what do we do now? So when George IV died, he had a younger brother, William IV, already 64 by the time that he becomes king. You can see his painting. He's already an older man. a bit more relatable than George IV, and that William had spent his life in the Navy and he'd sailed North America and the Caribbean. They called him the Sailor King. He did certain things, like he updated this poor law that was bringing unemployed people from rural areas into urban industrial jobs. He tried to abolish slave trade throughout the empire, but again, it was still existing. They were still doing business with people who had it outside the empire. Um, but he had a similar problem where none of his children, with his wife, lived to adulthood, and he had a whole passel of children, like 8, with an actress he was having an affair with, which made him not very popular with the people. Um, but again, he had no legitimate issue, and he was the last one of his father's children, and so it ended up, if you might know this name, that we move on to the next era, it's his niece who became queen at the age of 17, Queen Victoria. So we'll get to her in the Victorian era later, but these are the 3 gentlemen who reigned over the Romantic era. I have a picture on the right of Parliament. If you're unfamiliar, it's kind of, think of the American Congress or Senate. But at this time, the representatives were only land owning Protestant white men. And there were a lot of what was called rotten boroughs, where, the people who were voting really didn't have any say. Think of gerrymandering. Like, people in power were staying in power and making laws to keep themselves in power, and the rest of society really didn't have anything to say about it. So even though there was a parliament and there was a prime minister, things were going to get very shaky, and we'll talk about that as we look at what's going on in France. So this is what really reflects the Romantic era. Even though we're focusing on British literature, the Romantic era is so shaped by what's going on in France. And you have to keep in mind how close England and France are geographically. Like, at certain times, I think if you're in Dover and the, you know, lighting is just right, you can see France across the channel. So just keep that in mind. These countries are so interrelated, even though they've spent centuries, millennia, tearing each other apart. Um, the French Revolution. So in 1789, how do we even start? You've got Marie Antoinette. You might have heard that she supposedly said, "Let them eat cake." She never said that, but she was very much like George IV, kind of like the finer things in life, was very oblivious how the other half lived. Same thing with her husband, Louis XIV. Um, so what happens in the French Revolution? So instead of parliament, the French had, we'll call it, the Estates General was kind of the way their government set up. And part of the representatives were to represent the people. It was called the Third Estate. And they were so disgusted with what was going on in the monarchy and the, wealthy representatives, that they broke off, almost like they were going to form their own, I don't know if you want to say country, but their own governing body. And then all of a sudden, that they heard rumor that the military was going to come in and shut them down, that they rose up and they stormed the Bastille. This is 14th of July, Bastille Day in France. And they stormed the prison fortress, which is a symbol of royal authority, because that's where they would put anyone, kind of like the Tower of London, who dared to resist them. And things spiral. Like, Paris falls from the king's control. Over like the coming years, they capture the king, they capture the queen, they capture, like, the nobility, and the death toll ranged in tens of thousands just during this time, with 16,594 executed by guillotine, which you can imagine was pretty gruesome. And there was over 2,000 in Paris and 25,000 across France, just dying, not just guillotine, but being executed in various ways. No one's really in charge. Things are chaotic. The king and queen are killed after they've been, um, arrested and tried for treason. Just a lot of blood, a lot of insecurity. And again, while all this is going on, England is off to the sidelines, like, oh, geez, we kind of have a history of not representing our people, listening to our people. Are they going to be inspired by this? Is this what's coming for us next? And just a lot of scrambling, on the monarchy and the government's part to try to be more relatable, to try to avoid this. So in 1793, like, the Reign of Terror is going on, and Robespierre, you can see his image here, uh, becomes the representative of, like, I think it's called the National Convention at this time. And there's radicals taking power. And it's just, again, it's chaotic. It's always like, who's in charge? what's happening. There's paintings on the left of soldiers, like, just being picked up to be executed. No one was really safe. People were fleeing France for England and other parts of the world. Just a very scary time. 1795, there's a change of power. People have lost faith in Robespierre. There's a young general in the emerging military named Napoleon, who's had lots of victories, gets a lot of momentum beneath him. People are seeing that the power lies in the military. I'm not a military historian, but by any means, but they're battling countries around them, like for their autonomy, because other countries don't want to recognize them and they want their rights. There's an amazing, but pretty impressive invasion of what's now Austria. That he went through the Alps in the snow with horses and men and cannons, and they didn't expect it, and they were taken by surprise, and he won. And people were just amazed by his, just military strategism. He stages a coup, makes himself like, temporary king, kind of in response as people are plotting against him. And as there's more infighting, he just takes more and more control. He declares himself emperor, um, which is kind of ironic considering how the French Revolution started. By 1806, he's defeated Austria, he's defeated Russia, he's got England on the run, and he's just seeming invincible at this point. But by 1812, he's on a downward trajectory. He had a campaign into Russia that just decimated his army. The English then invade France, and there's Waterloo against Duke of Wellington. He gets crushed and he gets sent into exile. But this was going on for a very long time, right? 1793 to 1815, just chaos in France, and England is looking on. And I do want to note that a lot of authors, Blake included, Mary Wollstonecraft included, when the French Revolution began, they were 100% behind it. Like, yes, let's take down these rich bastards and the powers that be, and let's invent something great. And it's all for the individual. But it just went terribly astray. And I think that's part of the reason that England didn't do that. There was a lot of anxiety if that would happen to them as well. Domestic life. So coming back from Napoleon, let's talk more about the life that was going on if you had lots of money. Two categories of wealth. There's nobility, right? Which means somewhere in your heritage, a king granted one of your, I can use language, relatives of your ancestors, thank you. Like they did a favor for a king, and a king granted them a dukedom and a title and gave them land, and your money was from rents on that land or whatever was produced on that land and your holdings and all these things. So that was the nobility, right? Dukes, earls, barons, viscounts, marquises, all these things, right? That we hear in TV shows like Bridgerton or whatever. They've got Outlander. This is what you would do with your time, right? You had beautiful ornate sitting rooms where, you would propose, or you would go on hunting, trips. And fox hunting is absolutely terrible, but it was widely popular. You'd have month-long parties where people came stay at your estate, and you'd have dances and dinners and all these things. And that's what we see portrayed in film. If you were, nouveau riche, like newly wealthy, you might be trying to break into these circles. It was very difficult. So much protocol on how you approached whom and who you introduced first and who went into dinner first. And if you think about what people were suffering in other parts of the country, it all seems very, very silly. So middle class, as you might see on the left, if you were like a farmer or a merchant, you can see the inside of that dwelling is much more humble. um, day-to-day life was filled with have-tos, but, you'd be surviving, and have someplace warm to sleep at night, and you'd have food in your belly, unlike half the country. Whereas I'm going lower middle class is like this one-room dwelling, where you've got multiple people to a bed and, eating and living and sleeping all in the same room, but at least you have a roof over your head. Versus I have an illustration from what's the St. Giles area of London, which was extremely impoverished, people living on the streets in gutters. And, again, this is an era before birth control, before, government programs to assist. Not that those are always fantastic, but there just wasn't things to support the way that society was booming with the first industrial revolution. And there was a lot of poverty and a lot of crime and a lot of, um, they would just ship people off to if they weren't executing people for theft, they would just ship them off to Australia or other places, other penal colonies, just to get them out of the country because they really didn't know what to do with the rising poverty rates. The Industrial Revolution, I mentioned this is just the first wave. We'll talk about this in a lot more detail when we get into the Victorian era, which I would say starts 1837, but typically they count the first Industrial Revolution as 1760 to 1840. The processes became mechanized, right? That's the foundation of it. And products were manufactured for the very first time. During this period, the discovery of coal and its mass extraction, as well as the development of the steam engine, which was just moving in that direction, and metal forging completely changed the way goods were produced and exchanged. Inventions such as spinning machines and looms make fabric weaving, you know, possible to do in a grand scale. Canal transportation is replacing wagon transportation with mules. Like things are just exploding, but just almost like, and I will remember being, someone who was born in the 1900s, as my sons love to tell me, when technology like came about and people didn't know what laws there should be or how to monitor it because it was brand new and it was changing so fast. The same thing with the Industrial Revolution. If you look at the bottom right, a lot of people who did the mining and the chimney sweeping and the looming were children, and there were no laws to protect them, and families were starving. So of course they would sell you their child for like a shilling so they could eat, and you'd say you give that child work, and this is the kind of life they were looking towards. So laws would be made to try to correct this, but again, really horrific working conditions for millions of people. Two more, my friends, and we're through the Romantic era. Education. So even during this era, 2 centuries after the Gutenberg press, only a small section of the child population was receiving proper schooling. I mean, some people were being taught to read at home if there was time, if someone, could have the resources or a book or something to teach you. Um, but charity schools were emerging. That's the bottom left. And usually this was only boys between the ages of 7 and 11. And often merchants would establish a charity school or a poor school, they were also called, or a church would, with the goal of teaching basic math and basic reading to the masses. But, it was really education was something for the wealthy and especially wealthy men. And so the expectation was if you were a boy, you would have a tutor at home. And then when you were of age, around 11, you'd be sent to a boarding school like the one on the left. Obviously, that top left, obviously, it's an image. So this is more Victorian era. I think this is Hastings. But yeah, that you would be sent to whatever prestigious boys boarding school your dad went to, and you would be educated in that manner. And then of course colleges like Oxford and Cambridge were very important depending on what your goals were. Middle illustration, if you were from a wealthy family and you were a girl, you might have a governess, and you can see the girls are having a lesson with their governess and they're being interrupted by the maid for some reason. But again, you'd have to have all these people who worked for you and all this free time where you didn't have to work to get this kind of education as a lady. A lady's education was much different. It would be in like, yes, reading. You would need to be fluent in French, maybe some history, but more like arts and music and things that were considered aesthetically pleasing, where men would be more like sciences, Latin, Greek, things like that. Last slide. So when you think about the values that ran through the Romantic era, especially in terms of the art and the literature we're examining, I like to say if it makes any sense to you, if you know anything about the 1950s with kind of the culture was super, not everyone, but of course in general, the culture was like conservative and all about families. And I have an image here from the TV show, I think Leave It to Beaver, where the mom's in pearls and she's going to serve everybody dinner. And the dad's the patriarch and the children are well behaved and everyone's like the same religion. And fortunately in the media, like the same ethnicity, and everything is right. Just everyone agrees to the shared social norms. If that's the 1950s, and the 1960s is Woodstock and hippies and free love and rock and roll and mind expanding drugs, that is what the Romantic era is. They are the hippies. The era before them was the Age of Enlightenment, all about logic and science to a large degree. Lots of satirical writers, Age of Enlightenment, like Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope. We're moving into the era of feelings, just like the hippies did, right? So some of the values that you will see throughout this era, exoticism, like what's different, like bringing that into the moment, Gothicism and spiritualism, and ghosts and darkness and the unseen, imagination, being idealistic, intuition, going with your own, gut feelings and beliefs and big emotions, skepticism of institutions, right? Questioning the church, questioning the monarchy, questioning the powers that be, um, reverence of nature, of the natural world, accepting strong emotions, celebrating them. Again, the spiritual, the supernatural, all these things. So think Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or think this amazing painting that is usually seen as the quintessential painting of the Romantic era. It was actually by a German artist named Caspar Friedrich, and it's called The Wanderer Among the Sea. But just that it's just him surrounded by the natural world and the mystery and the fog and the light and the darkness. I think it really um, captures what the Romantic era was all about. So I will stop here. Brief thing to discuss on Blake's biography, and we'll move forward with this unit.